When we are young, love is filled with passion, promises, and sometimes heartbreaking endings. But when we are old, love is no longer so noisy. It becomes something simpler. A warm glance on a cold afternoon, a gentle laugh in a quiet room, or just someone sitting beside you, silent yet understanding. Mr. John had been living in this nursing home for more than 3 years. The day he arrived, his heart felt as lifeless as the winter garden outside the window. His wife had passed away, and his children, though they loved him, each had their own lives far away. They provided for him generously, giving him a good place to stay, with doctors and nurses always on call. But perhaps they forgot that people need more than medicine and full meals. They need something much simpler: companionship. Every morning, Mr. John would slowly stroll around the garden. Beneath the maple trees, turning red, he walked quietly, picking up fallen leaves and holding them under the pale sunlight. Some days, he sat for hours on the stone bench, simply listening to the birds sing and the wind rustling through the leaves. Life repeated itself like that. Not joyful, but not exactly sad. He had grown accustomed to loneliness. Until the day Mrs. Martha appeared. Mrs. Martha moved into the nursing home on a gentle September afternoon. At first, she was quiet, probably adjusting to her new life. But soon enough, her innate cheerfulness and optimism began to shine. She started chatting with everyone, bringing laughter and funny stories from her days as a nurse in New York. She refused to let old age imprison her spirit. The first time they met was in the nursing home's small library. Mr. John was leafing through an old book when she walked in. Smiling, she asked, "What are you reading?" "Let me guess. Historical fiction?" He looked up, slightly surprised but not annoyed. He answered slowly, "A novel, filled with love and war." Life always intertwines those two things. She laughed softly, like a passing breeze. "You talk just like the characters in those books." From that brief conversation, an invisible thread began to connect them. In the days that followed, they met more often. First in the library, then in the garden, later at social gatherings. They didn't plan it, but as if by some unseen arrangement, they always found each other in the quiet spaces of the nursing home. Mr. John enjoyed hearing her talk about her younger days in the bustling hospital, where she once rushed from one emergency room to another. And Mrs. Martha loved listening to his stories of history, which through his words became vivid and full of feeling instead of dry facts. One time, sitting under the old tree, Mrs. Martha suddenly asked, "Have you ever thought about falling in love again?" Mr. John stayed silent for a while before replying in his deep, gentle voice, "I think I had forgotten what that felt like, but life always holds surprises." Their days passed slowly, but were no longer dull. Every morning, they walked together through the garden where golden sunlight danced on the last leaves of autumn. In the afternoons, they sat on the porch, each with a cup of tea, quietly watching the sunset fall. Soon, the other residents began to whisper. Some smiled gently, calling it a sweet romance of old age. But others, like Mrs. Sophia, a grumpy old lady, shook her head and said, "At this age, still talking about love? How embarrassing." The whispers drifted through the hallways and rooms, but they didn't care. At their age, who had time to worry about what others thought? Until their families found out. One afternoon, Mrs. Martha's daughter, Julia, came to visit. She happened to see her mother holding Mr. John's hand in the garden. Julia's face showed a flicker of surprise, then turned cold. "Mom, how do you think Dad would feel if he saw this?" Julia asked softly but sharply. Mrs. Martha looked at her daughter, her voice gentle yet firm. "Your father has been gone nearly 10 years, Julia. I am still alive, and I have the right to feel happy." Julia fell silent, unable to accept it but unable to argue. As for Mr. John, his children began to call, asking about the strange woman their father spent time with. They were worried, afraid he was being taken advantage of, or perhaps they simply couldn't accept that he was seeking joy again. Mr. John quietly listened to all of it, offering little explanation, because he knew some things can only be felt, not explained. He no longer felt lonely during the long nights. Despite the gossip, Mr. John and Mrs. Martha still met each day. They no longer hid or avoided others' eyes. They knew that time waits for no one, least of all the elderly. One morning, Mr. John brought Mrs. Martha a bouquet of wild daisies he had picked from the corner of the garden. He said, "I don't know much about expensive flowers, but wildflowers are always resilient." Mrs. Martha smiled, taking the bouquet. "I prefer simplicity over anything fancy." He began to look forward to their conversations, her gentle laughter, and the way she looked at him warm and peaceful. But life is never only filled with sunny days. One late month, the nursing home announced a grand celebration for its 50th anniversary. Families of the residents would be coming. A big event where everything would be out in the gomas. Open. Mr. John and Mrs. Martha, though they didn't say it, both knew. On that day, their feelings would be exposed. There would be no more hiding. They would have to face disapproval, perhaps even hurt. But then, under the pale golden sky of the afternoon, Mrs. Martha softly said to Mr. John, "No matter what happens tomorrow, today I am happy because you are here with me." Mr. John took her hand, a hand marked by time but still wonderfully warm, and replied, "Me too, and perhaps that is enough." The day of the nursing home's 50th anniversary celebration arrived, carried on the chill of late autumn. That morning, sunlight filtered through the thin mist, casting soft rays over the small garden where Mr. John and Mrs. Martha often sat. Everything looked peaceful, yet inside their hearts, a quiet storm was stirring. Since early morning, the home had been unusually bustling. Staff hurried to hang flags, set up the stage, and arrange chairs. The elderly residents were cared for more attentively than usual. Everyone was neatly dressed and tidy, as if stepping back into the days of their youth. Mr. John wore an old suit and a tie he had carefully kept since his wife passed away. Mrs. Martha draped herself in a turquoise wool coat, her eyes shining beneath her silver hair. They smiled at each other, needing no words. At exactly 9 a.m., families began to arrive, one after another. The sound of laughter and cheerful greetings filled the air, sweeping away the usual quietness. Julia, Mrs. Martha's daughter, arrived first. Shortly after came Mark and Lisa, Mr. John's son and daughter. Julia approached her mother, her face stern, her gaze resting on Mr. John standing nearby. Mark and Lisa quickly noticed Mrs. Martha beside their father. For a moment, an awkwardness drifted through the crowd. Julia gently pulled her mother aside. "Mom, I need to talk to you." They walked to a quiet corner of the garden. Julia couldn't hide her frustration. "Mom, I know you're lonely, but this isn't the way to find joy. How do you think Dad would feel seeing you like this with someone else?" Mrs. Martha calmly looked at her daughter. "Your father has been gone nearly 10 years. Do you think I should spend the rest of my life alone?" Julia was silent, unable to hide her unease. She loved her mother but couldn't get used to the sight of her happy again. On the other side of the garden, Mark and Lisa were having a similar conversation with Mr. John. "Dad, who is she? Really? Is this serious?" Mark asked, trying to stay calm. "Have you thought about Mom?" Lisa added, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. John sighed softly, his eyes distant. "Your mother will always be in my heart, but I'm still alive, and to be alive means to feel joy, even if it's just a little, at the end of life." When the ceremony began, the director of the home gave a speech. Music played, and old Humai photographs were projected on a large screen, recalling memories from many generations. But no one noticed that, at the back of the hall, two families were quietly wrestling between love and judgment. When the time for performances came, the elderly residents were invited to the stage. Unexpectedly, Mr. John stood up and asked to sing a song. The entire hall fell silent. He chose the song Unforgettable, a classic love ballad. His voice was no longer smooth, but each word was filled with feeling. As he sang, his eyes looked only at Mrs. Martha, sitting quietly in the front row. Some people whispered, others simply listened. In that moment, everything seemed to pause. When the song ended, no one clapped immediately. A long silence lingered. Then from somewhere in the back, one elderly man clapped first, then another and another, until the whole hall filled with soft but sincere applause. But not everyone approved. Right after the ceremony, Julia pulled her mother outside. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. You're ruining Dad's dignity." Mrs. Martha looked at her daughter, her voice slow but firm. Dignity doesn't only exist in memories, my dear. It's also in how we choose to live the rest of our lives. Julia burst into tears, unable to find the right words. She loved her mother but couldn't grasp the deep loneliness inside her. On Mr. John's side, Mark was quieter but couldn't hide his discomfort. Dad, you always taught us about loyalty, about gratitude, and now you're like this? Mr. John gently replied, loyalty doesn't mean imprisoning your heart in the past. I've never forgotten your mother. But I can't live forever in sadness. Not everyone was critical. Mrs. Ellen, a cheerful elderly woman, came over to Martha and whispered, I'm happy for you. I once had a soulmate too, but I didn't have the courage to hold on to him. Some young staff members at the nursing home also shared among themselves. Anyway, they both look happier than before. Why do we make things more complicated than they are? As evening fell, families gradually left. The children carried home a mix of emotions, worry, sadness, and a faint stirring of realization. They began to see that their parents were still alive, and being alive meant they still had feelings, needs they couldn't fully understand. Mr. John and Mrs. Martha returned to the common room. They sat quietly beside each other, looking out the window, where the last maple leaves of autumn drifted gently to the ground. No words were spoken, but within them, there was a strange and quiet peace. The morning after the anniversary celebration, the nursing home returned to its usual quiet. The wind rustled through the bare maple branches, and pale sunlight shone down on the damp stone pathways. But in the hearts of Mr. John and Mrs. Martha, that quiet was no longer complete. It was weighed down by uneasy glances, brief phone calls from their children, and an unnamed worry neither of them could fully express. Everything seemed as though it would quietly drift by, as it had on countless days before, until one morning, Mrs. Martha no longer appeared in the familiar garden. Mr. John sat, waiting on the stone bench, counting each falling leaf. Time slowed like a drying stream, and an uneasy feeling slowly rose within him. Unable to wait any longer, he went to her room. He knocked. No answer. He called her name. Silence. A cold, heavy silence filled the air. He hurriedly called a nurse. When the door opened, he saw Mrs. Martha lying motionless on the bed, her face pale, her breathing weak, her body trembling in waves. The nurse informed him she had been running a high fever since the night before, likely pneumonia. They quickly called an ambulance to take her to the city hospital. Mr. John could only grasp her trembling hand and softly say, Don't worry, I'll be waiting for you to come back. As the ambulance drove away, Mr. John stood still for a long while, his chest tight as if being squeezed. A deep helplessness washed over him, just like years ago when he had watched his wife fade away in her hospital bed, powerless to do anything but wait. That afternoon, Mr. John didn't return to his room. He sat in the common room, where the two of them used to play chess, read books, and watch the sunset through the window. But today, the seat beside him was empty. He sat alone, staring out at the courtyard where the wind tossed around the last golden leaves of the season. That night, he couldn't sleep. Old memories flooded back like a torrent. He missed his wife. He remembered the day Ellen left, her hand holding his as she whispered, Don't stay lonely. For too long, John. If someday you meet someone who can make you smile again, don't hesitate. Back then, he thought she was only comforting him. But now, those words felt like forgiveness, the gentlest permission life could give. The next morning, the nursing home received news from the hospital. Mrs. Martha had severe pneumonia, but was no longer in critical condition. Mr. John let out a sigh of relief, tears clouding his eyes without him even realizing. For the first time in many years, he felt so clearly the fragility of life. He wrote a short letter to Julia, Mrs. Martha's daughter. In the letter, he simply informed her of her mother's condition and gently suggested that, if possible, she should visit the hospital. Reading the letter, Julia felt something settle inside her. Though she hadn't accepted her mother's new relationship, hearing about her illness made her unable to sit still. Julia went to the hospital and quietly sat by her mother's bedside. Looking at the once strong woman now lying weak beneath the white sheets, she suddenly realized her mother was just a person too capable of weakness, needing someone beside her at the end of her life. Her anger faded, replaced by a deep tenderness. During those days in the hospital, Mr. John and Julia had the chance to talk. At first, it was only polite greetings, but gradually they spoke about Mrs. Martha, about the loneliness of old age, and about the things young people often forget while chasing after their busy lives. Julia admitted, "I used to be angry with my mother. I thought she needed nothing but her children. But it turns out, no matter how much children love their parents, they can't fill every emptiness." Mr. John smiled softly. "We all love in different ways. The most important thing is not to let someone feel alone." A slow week passed, and finally, Mrs. Martha returned to the nursing home. She was thinner, her face pale, but her eyes were still as bright as ever. Mr. John welcomed her under the porch, where they used to sit every afternoon. There were no flowers, no grand greetings, just a cup of hot tea and a gentle smile. She looked at him, her smile tired but warm. "Did you wait long?" He shook his head, his eyes soft like the evening sun. "Not as long as I lived without anyone beside me." She laughed, a faint laugh, but still enough to warm his heart. In the days that followed, life gradually returned to normal. They still strolled through the garden, though her steps were slower than before. They still read books together, though she now needed reading glasses. Their conversations no longer carried deep philosophies or questions of right and wrong. They were simple stories of everyday life. Whether the sun came out today, whether the birds sang loudly, whether the tea was too bitter, Julia, Mark, and Lisa, after many sleepless nights, eventually chose to step back. They no longer forbade their parents. They didn't fully accept it yet, but they understood that their parents were human too, people who had spent their whole lives loving others and now only wished to find a little happiness for themselves. At the end of autumn, the last maple leaves fell. The air grew colder, but in the small room where those two aging souls sat side by side, a little warmth from their final autumn still lingered. Lying in the cold hospital room, between IV drips and the steady beeping of machines, Mrs. Martha drifted in and out of fragmented dreams. But perhaps they weren't dreams at all. They were the past, the thing no one can escape, no matter how hard they try. She remembered her younger years in New York. Back then, she was the head nurse, strong, confident, and so busy she rarely thought about herself. She met her husband, Peter, during a hospital charity event. He was a quiet, kind-hearted surgeon. Their love wasn't built on sweet words, but on long night shifts, on moments saving lives together, and on quiet hand, holding when exhaustion overcame them both. Their marriage wasn't perfect. Sometimes they argued over small things, a cold dinner, because she came home late, or weekends when he was called into emergency surgery. But those moments passed. They always found reasons to forgive each other, because in that crowded city, only they truly understood one another. When Julia was born, Mrs. Martha took a few years off to care for her child. On quiet afternoons rocking her daughter to sleep, she would smile, thinking her life was complete. A small home, a gentle husband, a beloved child, and a career she loved. But life is always full of surprises. At 52, her husband was diagnosed with late-stage lung cancer. He didn't smoke or drink it, was just cruel fate. The months that followed were a battle between hope and despair. She was both wife and nurse, caring for his meals, his medication, his long nights of pain. One winter morning, he passed away, as gently as a silent breeze. She sat beside him, holding his hand until the very end, but could not stop the tears streaming down her face. After that, the house became unbearably quiet. Julia had grown up and moved away for school and her own life. On lonely evenings, she made tea for one and replayed the old songs they used to listen to together. Sometimes she laughed, remembering his silly jokes. Sometimes she sat in silence for hours, staring at the coat he had forgotten behind the door. She once thought, "This is the end of my life. The rest is just waiting out the days, fulfilling my duties, nothing more." A few years later, as her health declined, Julia suggested she move into a nursing home for better care. At first, she refused. She didn't want to leave the house full of memories. But after a long, sleepless night, she understood. Memories aren't trapped in walls. They live in the heart. So, she agreed. In the early days at the home, She spoke to no one, only sat by the window, gazing at unfamiliar trees. But gradually, she realized she couldn't go on like that. She began to chat with other residents, joined group activities, read books, and planted flowers. She practiced smiling again, though it still felt a little forced, until the day she met Mr. John. He wasn't like her husband, but something about him felt familiar. His quiet demeanor, his sincerity, and the loneliness in his eyes that only those who had suffered loss could recognize in one another. She wasn't looking for love, but she found something else, understanding, something she had lost for so long. And now, in the cold hospital room, she thought about all of that. She knew she was old, knew her life was nearing its end. But if she could, she still wanted to live a few more days. Not to wait for anything grand, just to walk beneath the falling maples with someone, to drink a cup of hot tea on a cold afternoon, and to feel, once more, that she was still alive. Winter arrived slowly but colder than ever. The biting wind cut through the courtyard of the public nursing home, where the trees stood bare, stripped of their leaves. Snow had yet to fall, but the chill seeped through every window pane, into every trembling, aged hand. Mr. John and Mrs. Martha still sat beside each other every afternoon. No matter how strong the wind blew, they always chose their familiar spot on the porch, where the last rays of sunlight lingered at day's end. They no longer spoke much, for everything that needed saying had already been said. Now, simply being there with each other was enough. One day, Mr. John said to her, "I wonder about the days to come. If one of us leaves first, what will happen to the one left behind?" Mrs. Martha was silent for a moment before smiling. "That person will sit right here, in this place, and wait until we meet again." Mr. John looked at her, his gaze gentle, no longer afraid. At their age, death was no longer a calmer stranger. It was loneliness that was truly frightening, but now they were no longer alone. On one late winter night, Mrs. Martha felt more tired than usual. The nurse suggested she rest early, but she shook her head, saying she wanted to sit outside a little longer. Mr. John fetched an extra shawl for her and sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. The night sky was clear and full of stars, unlike other cold nights. Together they watched the stars, recalling stories from long ago of their youth, their first loves, and the people who had long since départed. Mrs. Martha whispered, "I never thought I'd find happiness at the end of my life in a place like a nursing home. But it turns out, happiness doesn't choose a place. It only chooses hearts that are still willing to open." Mr. John squeezed her hand, saying nothing. He had felt those words long ago. As the night deepened, Mrs. Martha gently rested her head on his shoulder, her breathing steady and soft. Mr. John stayed still, not waking her. He simply sat there as she slipped into a deep sleep. The next morning, the nurse found that Mrs. Martha had quietly passed away in her sleep. No sigh, no final words, just a peaceful departure, like a leaf falling from a branch, silent and gentle. Mr. John didn't cry. He simply sat beside her for a long, long time. He knew this pain of loss, well, just as he had felt when Ellen passed away. But this time, it wasn't emptiness, because he knew, at least in her final days, Mrs. Martha had not been alone. Julia came to the nursing home after receiving the news. She looked at Mr. John, no longer with anger as before. Quietly, she sat down beside him, took his hand, and for the first time, softly said, "Thank you for being with my mother in her final days." Mr. John gave a gentle nod, his eyes deep but no longer clouded with sorrow. In the days that followed, the nursing home returned to its usual rhythm. But inside Mr. John, everything had changed. He still sat on the porch each afternoon, still brewed 2 cups of tea, even if only he drank them now. That habit was no longer a sign of loneliness, but a way to remember her in the most peaceful way. One time, Mark, his son, came to visit and saw his father sitting there. Mark quietly asked, "Dad, are you lonely?" Mr. John simply smiled. "Number, I'm waiting." Mark asked no more. Some things need no explanation. Spring arrived. The bare maple trees began to bud once more. The birds returned, chirping on the branches. The nursing home remained quiet, but for Mr. John, every bird song, every ray of morning light was Martha's greeting from far away, a place without pain, without parting. He knew his day would come too, but he was no longer afraid, because when it did, he believed there would be someone waiting for him beyond the sky. 3 days after Mrs. Martha passed away, the nursing home held a small farewell ceremony. In the back garden, the place where she and Mr. John used to drink tea together every afternoon, there was no grandeur, no elaborate rituals, just a quiet afternoon with those who had loved her and the memories still lingering beneath the old maple trees. That day, the sky was clear, and soft sunlight filtered through the bare branches. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wild daisies that Mr. John had picked from the garden and placed on a small altar. No proud roses, no luxurious orchids, just simple daisies, as humble as she was. The director stepped forward and began with a few farewell words. We may remember Mrs. Martha as a wife, a mother, a devoted head nurse, or simply as a friend who brought laughter and warmth to this place. But above all, she lived fully and departed peacefully. Mr. John sat in the front row, quietly bowing his head. He didn't need anyone to speak about her. Every memory of her was already etched deeply in his heart. Julia stood up next. She held the microphone, her hands trembling, her voice choked with emotion. My mother wasn't perfect. She was hot-tempered, stubborn, and sometimes too blunt. But she taught me how to love, how to be strong, and how to forgive. In her final days, she found a new joy. I didn't understand it then. I was even angry. But now, all I feel is gratitude. Thank you, Mom, for teaching me that happiness is never too late. She paused, her gaze falling on Mr. John. Their eyes met in quiet understanding. After Julia, a few of the elderly residents shared their own small memories. Even Mrs. Sophia, the one who used to complain, stepped up, her voice low and sad. I used to think Martha was foolish to fall in love at this age, but maybe I was wrong. Not everyone has the courage to truly follow their heart, no matter their age. I wish I had done what she did. Finally, Mr. John stood up. He didn't bring notes or a prepared speech. He simply looked at the small photo of her where she smiled gently. I'm not here to say goodbye because she hasn't truly gone. Martha has only stepped away from this world for a while, but she remains here. He placed his hand over his heart. In my heart, and in every afternoon when the wind blows across the porch. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. We didn't have much time together, but each of those days was lived more fully than all, the long, lonely years before. And I believe if she could speak now, she would tell me, we didn't waste our lives. The space fell silent. No one clapped. It wasn't necessary. That silence was the deepest form of respect. Afterward, everyone gathered to release petals of wild daisies into the small pond behind the home where the water lay still and quiet. Each petal drifted away, carrying a farewell, a memory, and a promise not to forget. Mr. John was the last to release his flower. He stood by the pond for a long time, watching the petals float away with the current. Inside him, there were no tears, left only peace. As evening fell, everyone gradually left. The nursing home returned to its familiar quiet. Only, Mr. John remained, sitting beneath the old maple tree where he and Mrs. Martha had once sat, for hours, simply silent together. The cold wind blew through, but he didn't feel lonely. He pulled an old book from his coat pocket, the one he and Martha used to read together, and began turning its pages, softly, reading aloud as if she were still sitting there, listening beside him. When the last light of sunset disappeared behind the distant rooftops, he gently whispered, I'll sit here a little longer until we meet again. When everyone had gone, only Mr. John and Julia remained by the pond, where the daisy petals still floated gently along the quiet water. The wind blew softly, carrying the chill of late winter, but it no longer bit as sharply as before. Julia was silent for a long while before speaking, her voice low, quiet, and tinged with exhaustion. Aren't you sad? People say that when you lose someone, the sorrow stays with you for a long time. Mr. John gazed at the pond, where the last rays of sunlight sparkled on the surface, and replied, his voice steady and slow, Of course I'm sad, but it's not the kind of sadness that breaks me. It's a gentle sorrow, like when a good book comes to an end. You know it's over, but the beauty of it still lingers in your heart. Julia gave a faint smile, though it carried a hint of bitterness. I used to think losing my mother would be the most terrible thing. But sitting here, watching you, I feel strangely peaceful. Mr. John turned to her, his eyes old but not weary. That's because you're realizing something. Loss doesn't take love away. It simply transforms it. No longer a presence beside you, but a presence within you. Julia fell silent. She had never thought of it that way. She only knew how to cry, to regret, to blame herself. But here, in this quiet peace, she realized her mother had passed away, peacefully, without sadness, without leaving things unsaid. After a while, Julia asked, "Are you afraid? Of the day you'll leave, like my mother did?" Mr. John smiled, a deep and quiet smile. "I'm not afraid anymore. I used to be afraid of dying, of being alone, of being forgotten. But then I met your mother, and I realized the worst thing isn't death. It's living without anyone to love, without anyone to remember." He paused for a moment, looking into the distance. "Now, I have enough. I've loved, I've been loved, and I will carry those memories always." Julia lowered her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "I didn't understand my mother. I thought she was betraying my father, losing herself. But, in truth, she was just finding the part of her life she had forgotten." Mr. John nodded gently. "Sometimes people forget that the elderly are still alive. They're not just waiting to die. They're waiting for one more sunny day, one more laugh, one more hand to hold theirs." Julia turned to look at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a stranger who had intruded on her mother's life, but the man who had helped her mother find her final happiness. She spoke softly but sincerely. "Thank you for being there when I couldn't be." Mr. John smiled, his gaze distant. "That's not something you need to thank me for. It's something I chose to do, because she deserved to have someone by her side." They sat there together, quietly watching the last leaves fall onto the surface of the pond. There was no more anger, no more arguments. Only peace, understanding, and a love that had transcended death, beyond what people called right or wrong. As the sky darkened, Julia stood up and said gently, "I'll go now, but I'll come back to visit you. I think my mother would have wanted that." Mr. John nodded, not stopping her. He knew Julia's journey of understanding was far from over. But today, she had taken an important step, the step of forgiveness and acceptance. As she walked away, Mr. John remained seated, looking up at the night sky, where a single star had just begun to shine. He spoke softly, as if sending his words far away. "I'm still sitting here telling stories like we used to. If you can hear me, smile a little, won't you?" The wind blew gently, like a soft reply from the other side of life. When Julia's footsteps faded down the long path, the nursing home returned to its familiar quiet. Mr. John stayed by the pond for a long while, watching the moonlight ripple across the water. Tonight, there was no one sitting beside him, no one to share the quiet peace in the Promenclino cold breeze. And yet, strangely, he didn't feel the emptiness he had felt years ago when Ellen first passed. This time, the loneliness wasn't sharp like a blade, but soft like a thin blanket over his soul, cold but not painful. Slowly, Mr. John stood up and walked toward the main building. The long hallways and warm yellow lights were as they always had been, but his steps felt heavier tonight. He stopped in front of Martha's room. The door was closed and silent. Inside, everything was still in place. The wool scarf she used to wear, the unfinished book, and the cup of tea she had left behind. He didn't go in. He was afraid that if he stepped inside, the flood of memories would drown him before they had cooled. He just stood at the door, looking into the empty space, as if gazing at the emptiness inside his own heart. Then he quietly returned to his own room, simple, tidy, yet strangely empty. He took off his wool coat, hung it on the hook, and sat by the window where he and Martha used to read. Together, outside the glass, the wind blew hard, sweeping away the last dry leaves. He watched them fall, remembering the autumn afternoons when Martha sat beside him, softly laughing as she picked up a beautiful leaf, saying, "Every leaf has its own story." Now, those stories were his alone to tell. But he wasn't sad, because he understood that loss is inevitable. What matters is not avoiding loss, but living each day fully while you still can. He looked at the small table, where there were still 2 cups of tea, one for him and one for her. He picked up his cup and took a sip. The tea was cold, but the flavor remained. Just like Martha no longer present, but her warmth lingered inside him, gentle and comforting. In that quiet moment, he suddenly realized that all these years, he had lived too much in the what-a-body past. He had held onto Ellen's memory, clung to loneliness as a habit. But Martha had come and reminded him that he was still alive, still capable of love, still capable of longing. Perhaps that was her final gift to him. Not love itself, but a reminder of life. He sighed, but it wasn't a heavy sigh. It was one of release, as though he had finally put down a burden he'd carried for far too long. He stood up and opened a drawer, pulling out an old photograph of him and Ellen, taken many years ago. He placed it beside the small frame of Martha, letting the 2 most important women of his life share a place on his bedside table. He looked at them and smiled. "Thank you, both of you. One taught me how to love, the other taught me how to live on." Then he turned off the light, leaving only the soft glow of the bedside lamp. He lay down, pulling the thin blanket over himself. Tonight, for the first time in many years, he didn't feel like he was sleeping alone. Outside the window, the wind still blew. But within him, a quiet peace blossomed, silent and steady, like a small flame burning in the heart of a cold winter's night. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the crack in the window, falling across Mr. John's face, gently waking him from a long night filled with restless thoughts. He opened his eyes. The room was just as it had been, quiet enough that he could hear the soft whisper of the disbrode wind outside. He sat up slowly, his aging legs trembling slightly as they touched the cold floor. A fleeting emptiness swept through his heart as he turned to the side where the chair Mrs. Martha used to sit and make morning tea now sat empty. There was no soft laughter, no gentle voice, asking, "You're awake already?" Like every other morning. Only a quiet stillness remained, gentle yet profound. Out of habit, Mr. John stepped outside onto the porch. The freezing air made him shiver, but he didn't go back inside. He stood there, taking a deep breath. The wind blew just as it always had, and the pale sunlight still fell across the bare branches. Yet today, everything felt a little more distant from him. He quietly made his way to the small garden at the back of the courtyard, where each morning Mrs. Martha used to sit, pulling weeds and tending the wildflowers. Today, those flowers were still in bloom, though they looked a little wilted, as if they too had noticed her absence. He bent down, slowly picking up a few fallen leaves, gently straightening the stems, swaying in the wind. His old hands trembled, but his care remained steady, as if in this small act, he could hold on to a part of her, hold on to the routine they once shared. Returning to the common room, Mr. John took out 2 teacups, as he always did. But then he paused, looking down at his hands. Today, there was only one person left. He quietly put the Devon, 2nd cup back, placing it in the corner of the table where sunlight glistened softly. He sat down, took a sip of tea, and gazed blankly out the window. Other residents passed by. Some nodded in greeting, others simply walked in silence. They knew, they understood, and they respected his quiet moment. A young nurse approached gently and asked, "Are you doing all right today, Mr. John?" He smiled, a faint smile, but not a forced one. "I'm all right. It's just a little quieter than before." The nurse didn't ask anything else. She simply rested her hand gently on his shoulder and quietly walked away. Young people might not fully understand the loneliness of the elderly, but they know how to share it silently by being present. Mr. John opened the old book he and Mrs. Martha used to read together. The pages were still marked where they had stopped last time. He turned to the next page, reading aloud softly, as if reading to someone still sitting beside him. Between the lines of the book, he heard her laughter echoing faintly in his mind. He didn't know if it was an illusion, a memory, or something real. But he no longer tried to tell the Fox.com difference. Perhaps she was still here, in some other form, gentle and invisible. By noon, he stood up slowly and walked around the nursing home grounds. The wind still blew, the sky was still clear, and children from the nearby elementary school still laughed and played in the yard. Life went on, even when someone had left. When he stopped beneath the maple tree, where Mrs. Martha used to say, "This place is the most beautiful in autumn," he looked up at the deep blue sky and whispered, "I'll keep living, but not living alone anymore. I'll live with the memory of you, with the stories we haven't finished telling." And he smiled. A sad smile, but peaceful. Every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, Mr. John brought books to the common room, where a few other residents gathered, some whose eyes were too weak to read, others who no longer had the patience to turn the thick pages themselves. He chose simple books to read, some short stories by Hemingway, a few chapters from Adventures of Tom Sawyer, or even gentle poems he used to read to Ellen in his youth. His voice was slow and steady, sometimes low, sometimes lifting slightly, pouring emotion into every word. The listeners sat quietly, some closing their eyes, some occasionally smiling as if they were transported back to days long gone, when their hearts were still young and unburdened by time. After each reading, Mr. John closed the book, looked around at everyone, and asked softly, "What would you like to hear next week?" One elderly man joked, "As long as you keep reading, we'll listen to anything." For the first time in many days, Mr. John laughed, and this time his laughter was no longer forced. The small garden behind the nursing home, where Martha once lovingly tended each wild daisy, was now cared for by Mr. John. At first, it was just a habit, but over time, it became a source of quiet joy. Each morning, he went out to the garden, quietly trimming the wilted leaves, loosening the soil, and watering the plants. His hands were no longer steady. Sometimes he accidentally broke a young stem, but he was more patient than before. He placed a small sign in the middle of the garden, written in slanted, careful letters, "Martha's Garden." Whenever someone passed by and paused to look, he simply smiled and said, "She loved wild daisies. I'm keeping them alive so she won't forget this place." And he believed that wherever she was, Martha was smiling too, seeing the garden still blooming. In the evenings, when everyone had returned to their rooms, Mr. John took out paper and pen and wrote letters to Mark and Lisa, the two children he once blamed for being too busy, too distant. But now, he no longer blamed them. He simply wanted to tell them about his life here, about the little garden, about the books he was reading, and about the woman who made his final days less lonely. His days were no longer endless and empty as before. Every morning, he woke up with something to do, tending the flowers, reading a book, writing a letter. In the afternoons, he still brewed 2 cups of tea. He drank one and placed the other in front of Martha's small photo frame. He didn't think of it as a sad habit, but as a way of continuing the days they didn't get to finish together. He no longer counted the days. Because he understood what mattered was not how long you lived, but how you lived each day. He wrote slowly, each word, each line, as if speaking to them directly. "My dear children, life here is peaceful. I am well. I've learned that no matter how old a person gets, they can still find joy in the little things. I hope you both find that joy in your own lives, and don't wait until old age to realize it." He didn't expect them to reply right away. He only hoped they would read it, that they would know their father was still alive, not merely existing, but truly living.